during COVID, we could be a lot more decisive about, hey, this is what we have to do. And then there's other times, given the current workforce, where maybe it needs to be a little bit softer. And
Sure.
then there's also the post-COVID time of what is the new normal? How do we get back to sustainability? How do we do things a little bit differently? Where you have to think about changing the approach again, right? And so
Yeah.
I think what makes it so challenging overall in leadership is it's not like, you can open up your playbook, pick one of the plays right on the Madden playbook and say, yep, let's do this. Every situation warrants something a little bit differently, and the tact to and the wherewithal to be able to change on a drop of a dime is pretty critical.
The business of healthcare is hard, creating a badlands of terrain that is difficult to navigate. Some think the most brilliant minds in business are on Wall Street. They are wrong. The most brilliant minds are in healthcare. They have to be to thrive and survive. This podcast explores concepts in leadership, management, sales, and negotiation with those brilliant minds. The Healthcare Badlands podcast is generally planned, but unscripted, unedited, and uncut, so you get the honest and unfiltered experience. Your host is Dr. Tom McDougall, a 30-year veteran of healthcare with 23 years of hospital CEO experience. His guests are carefully selected experts from across the industry. They offer insights, expertise, and some great real-life, often hilarious stories. Now, let's jump into the episode.
Welcome. Joe Hwang is the Market Chief Operating Officer at Beverly, Addison Gilbert, Bay Ridge, and Anna Jacques hospitals for Beth, Isreal, Lahey Health in Boston, Massachusetts. Prior to that, Joe held various roles with Universal Health Services. He has a master's in healthcare administration degree from Penn State and a bachelor's degree from New York Institute of Technology. Welcome, Joe.
Thank you. Happy to be here. I will say this is the first podcast I'm doing. Just wanted to throw that out there. It's very
Well,
meaningful that
if
you've
you
asked
nail
me.
it, there will be a lot more in the future.
Yeah, thanks.
All right. So I got a question kind of get us started on this. You are a multi-hospital chief operating officer. So you've got multiple facilities that you've got to operate day to day, every day. How do you spend your day and how do you plan your time to make sure that all of the operational needs are met?
Yeah, so it's not easy. I have four different hospitals, all in different locations, and so how I'll kind of first frame it as how I structure my week. So I'll spend 2 days at one of my largest hospitals, Beverly. I'll spend 2 days at the newest hospital that I'm assuming operational oversight over, which is Anna Jake's. And then I'll have my last day as a flex day, to kind of determine, all right, am I going to go to one of our large outpatient sites? Do I go to Addison Gilbert, or do I spend time at Bay Ridge? So that's essentially how I structure my week. One of the things that's been pretty important is visibility, and it's tough, right? Because one of the things that we'll hear is, "Hey, ever since you guys have taken on the responsibility of the additional hospital, we haven't been able to see you guys as much." And then same thing on the other side of it, where um, you know at NHX, they're seeing us a lot more frequently than before, which is nice too. So it's how do we show our presence, not necessarily just lead behind the desk, but just be active, be ever present, be out there on the floors, and engaging with staff directly. So in terms of how I structure my day, one of the things that's pretty critical, and you'll remember when we were together at Manatee, we always do the safety huddles. So all of our locations will do the safety huddles. That'll really give us a good situational awareness, as you're aware of what's going on, what in the overall hospitals. What are some safety issues? What does the census look like? Any of the typical high level KPIs. And then the other thing that also helps is I have dashboards as well that I'll be able to utilize to just help get a good picture overview as I start the day of how it looked the day before and how it looks today. And then, of course, the most important piece of it is the people, the relationship side of it. I have all of our leaders are kind of dispersed throughout the different facilities. And so I always try to make sure that I touch base with everybody just to see are there any things going on. Yes, there's instances where we may have two simultaneous issues that comes up at the same time, and we do our best to divide and conquer for it. But it's one of those things where it's like a new muscle, where you kind of learn, figure out what works, what doesn't work, and make sure that the actions and operationally how I work, that I'm nimble enough to adapt to the culture of each location.
That's interesting. Yeah, listening to you about that, I was reminded of a couple of things I experienced during my career. One was my first mentor. When I took my first hospital CEO job, he would give me good advice, and he called them pearls of wisdom. It was actually pretty funny. But he told me, he said, "Hey Tom," he said, be seen by your team, but don't be seen all the time, because then they'll wonder what you have, if you have anything else to do. And I always thought that was an interesting point, because then later in my career, I had an assistant CEO that I heard people were referring to him as homeless Jim. And I thought, okay, why are you calling him homeless Jim? And they said, because he is always in our departments. We see him all day,
Mm,
every day. So he's always in our departments. He's always rounding. And so I say all that to say there's got to be this balance between being visible, but not creating this environment of intrusiveness, like we're watching over people. Therefore, there's a lack of trust. How do you manage that, both in terms of your presence as well as your communication style?
yeah, so great question. Because there always is a delicate balance. I do think one of the post-COVID benefits that have happened was the overall acceptance just everywhere of virtual meetings, right? I remember prior to that, it just wasn't as widely accepted. You had to be present. Sure, you can kind of pick up the phone and answer, but that having the ability to, whether it's Teams or Zoom, really helped to bridge the actual physical distance or gap up. So one of the things that essentially I tell all my leaders is, hey, if I need to micromanage and ask every little thing, why are you in the role, right? And that's not what we want to do as leaders. We're not here to micromanage. But really, what I tend to tell my folks is, hey, just I don't want to be surprised. So just let me know if something's going on, whatnot. You're here. You have the technical skill sets. You're in the seat for a reason. So let me know if there's something that you need. What can I do to help take down any barriers in the way so that you can be as successful as you can for your team and for the patients. I tend to say this almost facetiously, but I tend to view myself as overhead in the sense that I'm not taking care of patients like I might have, when I was on the back of an ambulance, right? So, because of that, I recognize how, since I'm not at the front lines anymore, I'm not actively, one-on-one taking care of patients or running the department. I tend to view myself as how can I help to reduce some of the barriers for the folks in the front lines? So that's how I always frame my messaging with my team and with the folks out there on the front lines of what can we do to make sure that you have everything you need, because you guys are the ones taking care of the patients. So that's how I tend to frame it, and it tends to go over pretty well because of that.
Yeah, that's excellent. I had a very humbling experience super early in my career. About 6 weeks into my first hospital CEO job, I got called for jury duty, and I did everything I could to get out of it. Which, I shouldn't have. I should have met my civil obligations. And since then, I've never tried to get out of one. But I was genuinely concerned because the instructions were very specific. Leave your cell phone in your car. You will not be reached. Tell your work that you are unavailable between, I can't remember if it was 8:30 a.m. and 3:30 p.m. or something like that. And I was exceptionally concerned as the hospital CEO. What am I going to do if my team needs me during that time period? And I spent 4 days not in contact with my hospital between roughly 8:30 and 3:30. And do you know what happened? Absolutely nothing.
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 The hospital ran fantastic. There were very few issues during that time period. It ran great, and it was exceptionally humbling to me. And I realized that on any given day, as a hospital CEO, not as much as COO, but as a CEO, you are arguably the least important person in that building, because in terms of patient care that will be delivered
Mhm.
that day, if I'm not in the building, patients are going to be cared for perfectly because I'm not providing any of the patient care. So your point earlier about, you kind of got that degree of separation. I think you're hitting on something, that the administration of the hospital is a cost center. It doesn't generate direct revenue in terms of patient care revenue. Yes, I think it does create an enormous amount of value for the organization, but not necessarily in that moment of one given day. That humility is something that I always carried with me throughout my career.
Yeah, and you know, I've had similar conversations with my leaders who, always feel like they have to be on the job 24/7. One of the things I do tell my team is, if you feel like you have to be on the clock all the time, nights, evening, weekends, holidays, whatnot, then you're not doing something right. Because what you want to make sure that you're building the bench strength, right? Think it's a succession planning so that, for you, you can kind of have some R&R, like rest and recover,
Exactly.
and that you're not always just in that mode of working. Like that's not healthy either. You want to have that good work-life balance. And then, just really making sure that you can feel like at any given point, if you have to go on vacation or whatnot, you don't have to be concerned all the time, and that you left the hospital or your department in good hands because you kind of built up that infrastructure to make sure that um, that the folks under you, your direct reports, that they're positioned well for long-term success. I tend to view, part of the role of operations and just overall, just how we manage. How do we have the processes in place that is not people dependent or human dependent, but the structure and processes are there that regardless of who's in the seat, it can still work very well. Like that. That's how I tend to view operations working very, as how it should be. It should be seamless.
Yeah, exactly. Definitely a measure of success, whether you're a CEO or a COO, is everything runs great without your input.
Yeah,
You've done
exactly.
your job. You've got the right people in the right positions. You've empowered them. You've explained to them, here's the policy, here are the practices we're going to follow, and that's not needed. So, excellent point. Okay, so you have spent most of your career as a chief operating officer, and
Yes.
I know that you have had multiple opportunities to advance to a chief executive officer role, but you have chosen not to do so. Um, so, talk to me about that conscious decision you're making and why you embrace and love the chief operating officer role and don't have, at least to this point, you've not had an interest in advancing to a CEO role.
Yeah, part of it is just the it's almost a new muscle or a new skill set. So someone had explained it to me where um there is a huge gap going from COO to CEO. Gap in the sense of what makes a good operator successful is a completely different set of competencies and skill sets, right? Like how do you have the masterful execution? How do you like some of the more blocking and tackling of all right, let's get contractually, let's get the PSAs a step up, physician services kind of set. Let's let's make sure we're getting staffing addressed so that we can continue to kind of build and develop the workforce. Whereas on the CEO side, it's a completely different skill set or core competencies, as you know, from operations. And at least for me, what I feel over the years, I really enjoy the ability to, take something from strategic concept that the CEO or we would kind of come up together with strategy and figure out a way to execute it. Like it's really fulfilling for me to take something that a year ago or a year and a half ago was just a concept on paper that we're thinking about and built a performa around and a business case, But to take that and bring it to real life, I find that pretty fulfilling. It's a lot of fun for me to kind of go from beginning to end and see it through to the end of it. And so it may part of it may just be a preference component. The other part of it may also be the fact that, as you know, on the CEO side of it, there's a lot of the relationship component that's critical in terms of relationship with the community, relationship with the board. It's just a um, different skill sets that admittedly, that's certainly not something that I'm prepared for. Every time I had been asked before, it's not that you certainly can't build the repertoire or the skill sets that you need to get there. But it's just, I guess, selfishly, it's not something that I feel that I've developed a skill set that I want to take the plunge. It doesn't mean that it won't eventually come, right? But I kind of have my comfort zone of, hey, I'm really good at this. I enjoy what I'm doing, and, unless I have a huge itch for some reason of wanting to take that next step, it just hasn't really intrigued me, to the sense. It's not that I can't do it, right? I've seen
Right.
and worked with a lot of CEOs. I've had to fill in, if they were on leave, on PTO. So I most certainly have seen it, but not to the same extent. I think there is a complete difference, of kind of filling in just interimly versus you're in the seat, you have ultimate accountability at the end of the day, and the buck falls with you, right? And I think it's just a different mentality shift that it's probably something that I'm not quite ready for. Just mentally, I'm not there yet.
Well, and that's actually a statement of extremely high emotional intelligence on your part because you thought it through and you focused in on those skill sets that you have and those that you enjoy, and you're focused in on it. I was the converse. I got approached, oh gosh, 10, 15 years ago about being a chief operating officer for a medium sized system. And I interviewed for it and I ended up turning them down. And the reason I turned them down was I just explained to them, I said, I don't think I'm a very good number two. That's just not my skill set. And they pressed me on it. They didn't like my answer. And I told them the truth. I said, you mentioned relationships earlier. Yes, I mean, the relationships, I enjoy that. That's one of my favorite parts. I'm exceptionally focused in on relationship building, and I think transactions follow. But my passion is strategy. I
Mhm.
love strategy. That's my favorite part of any kind of healthcare leadership role. But operations, I can do it, but it's not what I have that passion for. And, I was extremely fortunate when we worked together because you had that passion for operations where I didn't. I think that's one of the things that made us a good team.
Yeah, and it's not that the COO role, you don't dabble in the strategy. You certainly need to understand the big picture of where we're trying to go, right? And I tend to view the the equation as, let's just use the Pareto principle, right? The 80-20 rule.
Sure.
If the CEO, and I know it's not going to be perfect science, but just bear with me. So let's just say if the CEO was like 80% strategy, 20% operations, the COO is almost the inverse,
Yes.
where it's maybe 20% strategy, but 80% in operations on the day-to-day side of it. I enjoy having the ability to dabble and still be helping to set the strategy component. I think if that aspect wasn't there, I would probably want to look for something where I am more involved on the strategy piece of it.
Yeah, of course. Well, and you can't for any healthcare leader, you can't completely separate from
Yeah.
operations or strategy. You've got to have a foot in both. But no, I think you actually are very close on the 80-20. And when those lines get blurred, it's either because of micro or macro economic impacts. So if a healthcare organization is struggling financially, well, the CEO is going to have to spend more than 20% of their time on operations, just because of the importance of that topic. Um, but no, I think you're absolutely dead on. I like that a lot. The way you've thought it through and the way that you arrange not only your thoughts, but your actual work.
Yeah. I come up with good nuggets every now and then.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
This episode is sponsored by Audrey Health. Many hospitals rely on their employed primary care network for referrals. However, this comes at a cost as most hospitals operate these same networks on negative margins. Audrey Health is an innovative solution to eliminate these operating losses while maintaining the referrals. Learn more at audreyhealth.com. A link is provided in today's episode notes. So let's talk about, healthcare has gone through, and I said it just a few days ago, that the only constant in healthcare is change. And change occurs internally and externally. And I'm not sure there has been a 5-year period of more change than the last 5 years, just in terms of the extensiveness of the, before COVID financial challenges were ever present. And then we had the COVID experience. And then we have the staffing shortage. And then we got to move back into the financial challenges. And the hospitals have done, and they've done very well for the last 12 to 18 months. But now the forecasts are that hospitals are going to move into a difficult period with shrinking margins. Given that, how are you preparing your organization to deal with these ever-changing dynamics and the potential for shrinking margins over the coming 12 to 18 months?
Yeah, I mean it's valid. It's stressful. Just to kind of put it out there, it's not easy, right? Because at the same time, um, both sides of the equation, right? So reimbursement's getting impacted. It's getting harder and harder to increase and come up with ways to improve the top line component, right?
Right.
And the things that we can do to improve the revenue side takes time. There's some strategic things that you have to do, capital outlay or whatnot. And so a lot of the focus has been working towards the bottom portion, right? The expense portion. And it's been challenging for many, myself included. And it's one of those things where we tend to look at it from what are the low hanging fruits? What can we do? How can we work smarter? Try to frame it from a what's in it for me, right? So if we can work a little bit differently, rather than working harder, does that help us in terms of fill in some of the gap for a lot of the staffing vacancies that you're talking about? Because that's most certainly real. I haven't seen staffing challenges to this level compared to the past. It's getting harder and harder, and just whereas, let's say in the past, we may have had, position open, couple people applying here and there. I have positions open for more than a year plus,
Wow.
with barely anybody applying, right? So
Wow.
so we're kind of forced to think a little bit differently of it's important to keep hospitals operating, or I'll use the radiology department, right? Like how do you have the ED department open if you can't have the CT running? Like that's pretty critical that you'd need, or if you
Sure.
if you don't have an X-ray room. So we're trying to come up with other creative ways to still address, not forgetting that the most important thing that we're in healthcare is to take care of the patients, right? But how do we do it in spite of all the challenges? And it is one of those things where by looking at how do we come at this from a lean Six Sigma type of mentality? How can we craft some of the workflows, but at the same time, are there purchase services that we can look to help renegotiate? How are we doing on our supplies, some of the other components, and then everything coming together of how do we continue to drive so that it's as most cost effective as possible, right? That's all kind of part of the quadruple aim by IOM, is also making sure that we have good care that's also cost effective. And it's tough. I can't say that there's a silver bullet. And I know that's why there's a lot of hospitals in the nation. A lot of the hospitals in the nations are struggling in terms of even getting to break even, right?
Sure.
But
Absolutely.
it's one of those things that keep me up at night of how else can we, because you most certainly can't cut your way to success,
Right.
right? You've seen it from your experience. You can cut, but at some point, you're kind of bare bones, right? You're at the skeleton crew. There's nothing left, and so how do we, make sure that we can be thoughtful with our approaches on the expense side of it, but at the same time work from a long term strategy how can we continue to grow, think of new services and whatnot. You got to do both it simultaneously, because otherwise we've seen other institutions where care does start to get impacted if you only focus on cutting.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and economic theory of rational choice theory that exists. So you're always evaluating opportunities at some level, consciously, subconsciously. But there's also the element of bounded rationality. So you never have complete information. No decisions are made on 100% perfect information. So how do you manage that? Is it a gut instinct when you think you know enough to make a decision and move forward, or share with me your thought pattern on that?
Yeah, and everyone has different approaches. I recognize it. And sometimes data is perfect, imperfect, is what I mean, right? Because you can have garbage in, garbage out when it comes to data. So how do you balance the the inability sometimes to get good data that you need to make a decision, but at the same time, not run into a situation where you have analysis paralysis, right? Because you also can't do nothing forever. That while yes, doing nothing can certainly be an option, it may not be the right option. You may have to do something. There comes a point as I go through the mental model in my mind of what are the different scenarios. I ask a lot of questions. I tend to take more of a Socratic method of
Sure.
asking why, trying to have different perspectives to understand um, 360 of what are the different things that we're thinking about. Are there unintended consequences of some of our decisions? Um, Whereas in the beginning, I may want to just kind of rash say, "Oh, it's so obvious, this is what we got to do." But once you start to take into um, the more whole picture of different perspectives, you know, having the wherewithal and the ability to not stick to your guns and be willing to change based on new information coming in, I think it's critical, right? And there'll be certain decisions that we may need to make that was the best information that we had. Right. And
Right.
given,
Absolutely.
it was imperfect. Right. But now that we have new data, let's pivot. So perfect case in point, right, would be during COVID. Um, there, in the beginning, there was no best practice. We were all, as a nation, as healthcare institutions, figuring out as we were going, and that was kind of abnormal, because we are so science driven. We're so focused on what's the best practice in order to do it, but there was no playbook, right? So taking, all right, we think this is the best information that we have at that time. Let's implement. Um, I'll use the negative pressure rooms, right? So an example that I can give you a story is during COVID, we did not have enough HEPA filters to create a lot of negative pressure rooms, right? So one
Hmm.
of the things that we were thinking about was, okay, what a great way to scale this, given the fact that we don't have 50 independent HEPA filters machines. Why don't we just create one massive unit, like what we had seen in New York or New Jersey, where you would don and doff, get the bunny suit on?
Right.
How much easier would it be? And we can maximize and creating more negative pressure given the constraints, because everyone was all vying for the negative pressure filters, right? The HEPA machines.
Sure.
So that was our initial thought process when we were going into it was, hey, this will be great. We can just create a ante room, right? Donned off the bunny suit, go in, and what a great way to automatically create 18 negative pressure rooms than needing 18 individual machines. So that was the initial thought process as we were first going through it. Um, it was good in theory, good in concept, a lot harder in practice, right? Because what happened was, the staff that were going in had to be in the bunny suit for 8+ hours a day. They couldn't even take off the mask in order to drink water, and so it made a lot of strategic sense with it, given the finite restraints that we had, and we saw some other hospitals were starting to dabble in it. So we gave it a try as well. A lot harder when it came to day to day hour by hour practice, it just wasn't as practical. And so, we've learned from it, and that the next time that we had done it, we changed the model. We did it a little bit differently for that. So it's one of those things where, try to make the best decision based off the information that you have, knowing it's imperfect, but have the ability, the humility to admit, hey, that didn't work like what we thought it would be. Own and say, let's try something different, and then be willing to pivot if we need to, not just stick to our guns because that's the decision we made.
Yeah, and I found because the leadership roles have to evolve given the environment. And what you brought up is a perfect example because I can remember right in the height of COVID, I was in a facility that we had the second and fourth confirmed COVID patients in my hospital in the entire state. And so we truly were working without a net. We had no idea what we were doing, and the physicians were excellent, but they were trying to figure it out as they went along. But it was probably 2 weeks into that, sitting in a room, somebody had to make a decision, and I was a CEO, so everybody's looking at me. And with all the confidence I could muster, I said, "This is what we're going to do." And I laid out the exact plan, the timeline, and thank God it worked. But about 4 or 5 days later, my assistant CEO came and said, "Can I talk to you for a minute?" And I said, "Sure." He walked in, closes the door to my office. He said, "I got to know." He said, "How did you know that was the right answer? How did you know that?" And I told him the truth. I had no idea. Zero. And he said, "How is that? You were so confident in your delivery of the solution." And I told him, I said, in that moment of time, people needed to have confidence it was going to work. I just didn't know if it was going to work. But it was the best opportunity we had. It was the only solution that seemed to make sense at the time. And I knew we could pivot out of it. But I had other periods of time in my career when I wouldn't have been that bold without qualifying it. I would have said, "Hey, I'm not sure what the right answer is, but I think we should do this based on this." And and somebody would say, "Well, you're hedging in that situation." But the environment needed to be one where we were building trust with our staff, as opposed to during COVID, the staff had trust because somebody was in charge and somebody was making a decision. So talk about how you've experienced that and how you kind of evolve your decision making and your management style, given the environment that you're operating in.
Yeah, it's the ability to wear different hats given the situation or the circumstance. There could be times where, we may be going into a meeting, ready to say, all right, this is gonna be the approach that we take. But the meeting doesn't go how we were thinking, right? And it goes a little bit south. I don't want to give a specific example, but there was a negotiation that you and I were in together with a specific group. Um, we were getting ready to um, come in, have a very specific set of actions of what we wanted to do. But the meeting went completely differently from what we had expected. Now,
I
I know it's a
remember the meeting
little
you're
bit better
referring
to
to.
say exactly what specialties, but I just want to, preserve some of the
Yeah, stay
privacy
vague.
there.
Stay vague, Joe.
Yeah, yeah. So I just want to be a little bit just respectful because of that. But it completely changed because you, me, Andy, we kind of got together to say, yep, this is exactly what we're gonna do. And the meeting went anything but.
Right.
And so I think it's the ability to it's always good to game plan, right? Have exactly a set of actions of what we're going to do, but having the ability, given the moment, what's going on, the ability to read the room, get to understand what's the politics behind some of the issues, and not stick to the guns if the situation doesn't warrant it, right? Um, and I think that's important. There may be times where, depending on which hat we're wearing and the circumstance, it may be one where we're having a tough conversation and we need to be a little bit more supportive, but at the same time, give some crucial feedback, right?
Yes.
It may be a time where we kind of talked about during COVID, we could be a lot more decisive about, hey, this is what we have to do. And then there's other times, given the current workforce, where maybe it needs to be a little bit softer, And
Sure.
then there's also the post-COVID time of what is the new normal? How do we get back to sustainability? How do we do things a little bit differently? Where you have to think about changing the approach again, right? And so
Yeah.
I think what makes it so challenging overall in leadership is it's not like you can open up your playbook, pick one of the plays right on the Madden playbook and say, yep, let's do this. Every situation warrants something a little bit differently, and the tact to and the wherewithal to be able to change on a dime, drop of a dime is pretty critical.
Yeah. No, that's an excellent point. All right. I do have a question for you though, because I know you well from our time that we spent together, and you have a tendency to be a little bit blunt. Um, and on occasion, maybe not just a little bit. Talk about that style that you've adopted and share about how it works for you.
Yeah, so I'm more surprised that my mouth sometimes has been gotten me more in trouble over the years. But I've worked on it, right? So just I tend to say what's on my mind, and I don't know if that's something that's pretty unique about it, but I was accustomed to that just growing up in New York. That's how everyone spoke. We just kind of said what's on our mind, said our piece, and just moved on. There was a time in grad school where I probably should have been a little bit more tactful. So I'll kind of share the story of what happened there. So I was in a class in grad school. And my professor had given about a 45-minute presentation on here's the approach of how we do peer reviewed research. Look up the articles. It was a very similar to like a PhD type of approach, right? Because we had PhD students that we were mixing with in that class with our MHA. So she went through this whole approach. Here's how you search on PubMed. Here's exactly the right types of phrasing to use. It's not a simple, yep, I'm going to look up this topic and you're good. It takes a lot of different keywords and careful thought. And of course, towards the end of the presentation, she says, pretty passionately, "Hey, I know this was some pretty meaty topic. If there's anything that if you guys need support, I'm always open for office hours. Let me know what we can do because of how important this topic is." And of course, me just being me at that time, just went, "Nah, we're good." I blurted it out for the class. We'll just Google it, and she just went off on me like how dare you, like it was but and everyone in my class was just face palming saying, "Oh, Joe." But I learned something, right? Because I just said what was on the top of my mind. I had intention, but my intentions didn't portray with my words. So what I was intending and what I was trying to do was I was trying to be thoughtful about not taking up her time, and I was trying to say, hey, there's a resource now. We can Google the approach of how to do it. But as you know, it's not what you say, it's how you say it. And I've learned since then, since grad school.
Timing is
Uh,
everything.
yeah, I've learned how to be a little bit more thoughtful with my approach, how to craft specific messages, because in our roles, we're talking to the chamber. So we need to be careful, right, about what we say when we talk to employees. Some of the words that we do say does carry a lot of weight, and so it's very important to be able to um, not necessarily be scripted, so to say, but just be thoughtful because of how words have meaning, right? But to answer your question, um, my approach is such that I do tend to say what's on my mind, and I can be pretty blunt about what I want to say, but I do it in a way that is respectful. Now I'll add in sometimes a precursor of, hey, it may come off this way, but this is what I'm trying to say. But I do tend to ask pretty outright certain questions, and I know it does surprise people because not everyone is so forthright. about it. I don't think you were accustomed to just how blunt folks can be, or I was until you got a chance to work with me, because I'll just say what's on my mind. But one thing that is important, right? Like in the meetings that you and I may have, where or if it's a small group, what you'll see is I'll speak differently, and I'll be different levels of bluntness depending on the audience,
Yeah,
right? So
absolutely.
if you were to see me present, let's say in a leaders meeting, how I carry myself and the messaging, very different than, let's say, if it was a smaller, smaller SLT type of setting, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and you know me, I take my job very seriously. I just don't take myself very seriously. 80-90% of the time you can keep things kind of lighthearted and still get your message across and get the things done. But my favorite story about your bluntness, and you may not even remember this, but when our associate administrator was promoted from our organization and he was leaving, I had a concern because he was great for my ego, for my funny jokes and my not
Oh
so
yeah.
funny jokes. He would not just laugh, he would laugh with enthusiasm. And it was really good for my ego. I felt funnier around him. And I remember the conversation you and I had in one of our executive team meetings when I told you, I said, "Hey Joe, now that we've lost this team member, you're going to have to step up and laugh at my jokes." And you did not crack a smile. You sat back in your chair and you said, "Well, I'm not laughing if they aren't funny." And I will
Yep.
never forget that.
Yeah,
And
I
that's
had
one of the
that
reasons I liked you
yep,
so much.
that deadpan face. Just say it as is, right? Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it was fantastic. Well, Joe,
Yeah,
this
I
has
mean,
been great. I really appreciate your time today. You've done a fantastic job. I know Beth Israel is very lucky to have you, and I wish you nothing but success going forward.
of course, thanks for inviting me.
Thank you for listening to the Healthcare Badlands podcast. As always, please like and subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. If you have suggestions for topics or guests, please email those to podcast@badlands.pro. This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only and should not be considered legal advice. Some information shared may include fictitious names. The opinions expressed are solely those of the host and/or guests and are their own and not reflective of the opinions of others or our sponsors. Thanks again for listening, and we hope you'll join us on the next episode of the Healthcare Badlands podcast. Until then,